So, as I said, the evidence on trade and gender is of two main kinds. There's the cross-country econometric evidence, and then there's the case study evidence. And particularly on the case study evidence, they are so rich and so detailed, and there are so many comparisons you can make, but so many specific context-dependent effects that unless you are only interested and determined only to look at cross-country quant evidence, I would strongly recommend you choose at least a couple of the case studies and read those, because I can't do justice to the details in this presentation. This is kind of an advert to try and get you to read a few of the case studies and to look at the econometrics, so that's relatively straightforward, if not completely conclusive. So, one thing is pretty conclusive, that it's pretty much accepted as what we call a stylized fact, that industrialization in the context of globalization is as much female-led as it is export-led. And whereas traditional commodity exports, so the primary crops, the mining and so on, whereas that was typically quite male-dominated, these days the South Asian export industries, the tigers, the rapidly newly industrializing countries, has been very heavily female dominated in terms of around 80% of the labour force. Zeroing in on one particular country, and our first case study, which I really recommend you read, Kabir, is so readable, so clear, and beautifully combines both quant and qual data. She looks at the Bangladesh cluster of garments exporting factories in Dhaka, and she finds that out of 1.8 million workers involved in the finished garments trade in Bangladesh, 1.5 million were female. Yeah, if you like some concepts, this section is, unlike the previous section, this section is mostly about looking at evidence, but you can do some really simple kind of back of the envelope comparative advantage type arguments, which get you a fair way. If you imagine that you had 100 women involved in what you call brain, or blast, I must forget this touch sensitive screen. If you had say 100 men involved in and 100 women involved in brawn works, this is stuff where physical strength gives you an advantage. You can contest this. Many females are stronger and more capable than many males, but on average there's a difference in which males are stronger. So on average males have got an advantage in this brawn related work, and on average I think it's also pretty well accepted that on average males and females doing brain related work, programming, sort of technical assembly and so on, there's no difference between them. They're equally capable. So if you have say 100 women doing each of these and 100 men doing each of these, if you took one male out of here and put it into here, and took a female out of here and put it into here, then you've got this, you have one fewer men and one fewer female doing this, but because they're equally capable, there's no difference to output. But here you've increased one man and decreased one woman, so this is increased. So the point is you can have a Pareto improvement, having just as much of this, but increasing your production in this side. So eventually most men should move this way, most women should move this way, until you maybe hit the area where you're getting away from the averages effects. But this is a fairly simple and almost laughably simple, but it does fit the stylized facts remarkably well. Yeah. And as technical change increases, this effect should be bigger. Yeah. The area where they're equal should be bigger, so you expect more women to come into this. Then, if you take that theoretical argument and you say, well, okay, if also you have economies where women are relatively low paid compared to men, so attractive for an employer, if they're hard working, if they have skillful, nimble fingers, as a famous person once claimed, if also they're not really seen as the main breadwinners, so they're just maybe earning some extra money for their family, some pin money, some sort of money for housekeeping chores, they're not the main breadwinner, so they don't necessarily be seen in that way of supporting a whole family. If also they're happy to work for a few years and then go off and start their families, they're not really looking for going up the career ladder. They're educated enough to do the job, but not too highly educated that they have high expectations. If, sort of to summarise, they're quite docile, they haven't got political power, they're not going to unionise on you and start pressurising their MPs to do something about it if they're in a poor situation. If all or many of these things are true, that also fits this idea of export-led growth, but export-led growth at the expense of women. So this is the killer term. There seems widespread agreement that countries have had growth miracles, and it has been largely driven by export-led growth, and that has largely been women doing that work. But has it been at the expense of women? Because women have been kept back in terms of the conditions and the careers, promotion expectations, and their ability to organise and campaign for better paying conditions and so on. So that's the charge. It's at the expense of women. Now, there's lots of people have looked at cross-country evidence on this. I've chose this one to show you because it's one of the more accessible ones to show quickly in a lecture. Is that this is Blanton, yeah, the Blanton one. I like this because it's simple. Unfortunately, it's only looking at evidence of investment from the US, so investment from Europe and increasingly other areas like China and from other developing countries is not shown, from Japan. But what they're looking at here is what seems to be correlated with more US foreign direct investment, as it's the educational attainments of women, is the educational gap. So this is men having an advantage over women in terms of education. Is it women's political rights? So women, that's actually these are all positive. So women having higher political rights. Is it women having higher economic rights? And they found really no relationship there. Slight negative relationship here. It seems that some evidence that women having a less education deters investment in low-skill manufacturing. Otherwise, very little. But when it comes to the services sector, they did find some quite clear connections, but some of them in the right direction. That women having higher education attracts investment in. Women having an educational disadvantage actually puts investment off, because that makes sense, because in the services you want to invest in women who are well educated. However, slightly more worrying is this one here, the negative thing on political rights, particularly the significant one. Some evidence found by Blanton and others that there's a negative coefficient in our economic rights. So to summarise sort of on that stage, in the extractive, high-skill manufacturing sectors, no real effects there. They're quite male-dominated anyway. Low-skill manufacturing services, that's the opposite of what the Brand Drummond and other critics are saying, which is that FDI is actually attracted by a lack of education equality. However, educated by more foreign people labour. The one negative thing here we find here is that foreign direct investment is attracted by lower female economic rights. So women have got less economic rights in terms of, say, maternity leave and so on, then that tends to attract foreign direct investment, according to Blanton's figures from the US. So that's the concerning figure, the concerning result there. Others, I recommend you read several of these, because they're quite quick to look through the results. Austin Dork found that Rob can't handle a touchpad. Found that the wage gap decreases with FDI. So as countries attract more FDI, it tends to decrease the wage gap, and as they get more trade, again that decreases the wage gap in higher and middle income countries, and there wasn't really an effect for the poorer countries. Richards, who as well as these results, provides a really excellent data set. And if I forget to mention it again, if you want to do this either for essays for this subject, or maybe if it's too late for that now, your dissertation, the series, the Singali and Richards here and Singali, another author, have got a wonderful online data set which links into all kinds of things that's usually hard to find data on, so detailed stuff about gender and other social factors. Anyway, Richards found that trade openness is positively associated with the Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. I should have mentioned these. GDI is the same as the Human Development Index, so education, life expectancy and income. But each of those three things you replace with the ratio of men to women and then construct the index. This one brings in further factors such as what proportion of women are in senior management roles and engineering roles and so on, adds that into it. They find this is positive, but they find that positive news is maybe not so convincing because these numbers anyway, as others have said, tend to be very heavily positively correlated with GDP. So it's hard to be sure that you're really stripping out effectively the effects of that general correlation. But when they find their own data set, which they claim is much more sensibly and finely tuned to the other social and institutional factors affecting women, they find a positive link with trade openness, which is good. The worrying one from them is they find a negative link with portfolio I and none with FDI. Remember, foreign direct investment is when you have a long-term stake in a company, so perhaps you've been involved in, you've got some partial ownership of the country or full ownership or long-term supply contracts. In that situation, if women start getting more political and economic rights, you won't tend to pull out straight away because you're going to, maybe they've joined the union, they've paid for extra rights, the government has brought in maternity leave and protection for women's employment. You won't be so quick just to run away and pull your investment out because it's a long-term relationship. You've been building out that factory for a number of years, you've got long-term contracts. So it doesn't seem to be an association there. But portfolio I is otherwise known as hot money. If you just bought bonds, shares that you can sell, particularly things that you can get rid of quite quickly, it seems quite clear that when women in those situations start to get more social, economic, political rights, that is linked clearly with the negative effects on portfolio investment. People can pull millions, trillions out of a country at the drop of a hat if there's any sign of things which they perceive as problematic. So that's the worrying sign there in the cross-country evidence. So if you look at a number of these, is trade really related to gender inequality? And most studies find kind of weak mixed results, some sign of problems, other signs there's not in problems. It seems to vary according to what measure you choose, what sector you choose, which country you use, what period of time. But can find so far neither a smoking gun, proving Stephanie Seguino, the feminist economist, point right that this has been built on the backs of unequal exploitation of women. There's neither a smoking gun found to show that's the case, or we can't refute that. The figures don't show, hey, growth has been good for the girls as well as the guys in terms of trade. So because we need two things. We need better quant economic evidence and international evidence, and we need other kinds of evidences too, which is detailed case study evidence we turn to now. So this, as I said, is really just an advert to say, please go and read this stuff. So if you're interested in Latin America, really excellent stuff. In the band of territory along the Mexican border, there are workers known as maquiladoros, but the term maquiladora has been coined to refer to the females. And even though, of course, the positive side is that millions of people flock there from Mexico to get jobs that are incomparable compared to what they get elsewhere in the economy, but they're still pretty tough, not great paid jobs by international standards, and certainly the females are among the lowest paid, most exploited jobs, worst conditions, fewest protections in terms of job security or social protection. Yeah. That's the Latin American one. In Dakar, going back to that, the finished garments production, women, there's certainly not something that would make a Western person jealous. In terms of their alternatives, just far better conditions. I mean, she compares people working in Dakar both with the rural areas but also with the alternatives available in Dakar, the local private sector, the working as in terms of domestic service and shopkeeping, working as on your own account as a producer if you have your own sewing machine. All those have got their advantages, but if you get a job in one of the actual formal sector exporters to Next or to what's the big French one? Can't remember. Then your pay and conditions are incomparably better than anything else on offer. This one's a really interesting one. Uganda. The people that choose to go for cash crops in Uganda, in terms of coffee producers, they earn more in cash terms, but they don't escape poverty. They remain poor, though cash terms slightly better off than others, but they face longer hours and they face higher costs in terms of food costs and so on. And it seems that in terms of the researchers' ability to measure their cash income, it's clearly better. But other indicators of quality of life, including the nutrition of their children, is worse. So that's a really intriguing article about the effects of trade starting to come in to women in that sort of semi-subsistence, semi-commercial sector in Uganda. Really interesting article. Senegal, again, another two-sided thing, but slightly clearer to make out what's happening here. Martin's application of value change, of course, a large part of the article is showing just how small a part of that value remains in Senegal for stuff that's exported to supermarkets in the West, in Japan and so on. But he found that with liberalisation, as contractors have more opportunities to sell cash crops, they found that women were much less able to seize those opportunities than men, because they got weak rights over land, over the ability to get inputs and labour. So if someone's thinking about, shall I offer a contract to this person to supply me with onions, tomatoes, green vegetables, mangoes for export, they're worried about offering it to women, because has the women really got the right to hold on to that piece of land and deliver the contract? If it starts becoming valuable, will men in her family take over that land and she won't be able to supply your goods? Once that market starts taking off, everybody's going to want inputs of fertilisers, inputs of water, inputs of labour. Are the women going to be able to control that, or is all that going to go to the male producer? So they find this is why women didn't do so well as producers. But on the side of employment, whereas women have been fairly marginalised in terms of cash employment, as employment increased, 90% of the jobs in mangoes and beans, 60% tomatoes, all those new jobs went to women, and not on unfavourable terms. Conditions, wages comparable to men, reducing the gender wage gap, empowering women. So two sets of really clear conclusions, really badly disadvantaged as producers, but huge step forward as employment. So Senegal, liberalisation of the agricultural exports, good or bad for women? Answers, what is it? Not simple. Okay, very quick sketch of those, but please do read some of the case studies at least, as well as the econometrics. So finally, to draw something from this, it seems quite clear there are many interactions of general economics, both microeconomics and macroeconomics, and I've just had time to sketch a few of these. Trade, as you would expect from that picture, is also heavily gendered, particularly in the countries that have made such enormous gains from trade in recent years. It seems clear that there are a huge role for women and many unanswered questions. And we again return to this next week in the lecture, particularly on the special export processing zones. But is it, and this is the Stephanie Seguino phase, is it countries strategically exploiting this gender inequality and a race to the bottom? Those controversies, I think, neither the econometric evidence so far, because I think it's unanswerable at a global level. Clearly, in some places the answer is yes, in others no, in others it's mixed. So you need to look at both kinds of evidence, case studies, particular countries and sectors. Regulation of labour standards, the evidence on that seems that it's in places where state involvement is good, like the excellent example of Vietnam, another article from Kabir, which is on the reading list. That's very effective, but it's very ineffective, as in cases like Bangladesh or Uganda, where state enforcement is weak. You just don't reach the informal subcontractor networks. And what Kabir shows is that in Vietnam, it's very effective. In Bangladesh, it's very effective in the main contractors who are supplying the orders. But in their huge subcontractor networks, who do a lot of the work to supply them to go and supply the orders, all the regulations just get skirted and ignored, and you end up with tragedies like the Rana Plaza disaster and other tragedies. So if regulation is not the whole answer because of weak state capacity, The other big answer has been social movements, people refusing to buy goods from certain chains or insisting on certain labels to say that they've had better wages and conditions, or other forms of consumer pressure. And there is some evidence that that does work by exerting pressure from the top down the value chain. And you get many factories these days, it's commonplace to be visited by people from head office looking at these indicators and criteria and different labelling schemes to show that there has not been gender exploitation. And there's some evidence this to succeed, but the question is, can it work at scale? The Bangladesh one is a case of pessimism, because the inspectors will come year after year after year to the main factories, also similar findings in Cambodia, but they won't get out to that subcontracting network. So it's very difficult to scale it up. Another one which we see, particularly in the attempts to impose standards on trade, is very often for rural economics, people will focus on whether or not the men or the women are getting a fair deal. And in the Senegal case, that can actually flip it and make it seem much worse than it is, because even though poor farmers in poor areas in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, rural farmers are very poor people on average. However, they are clearly not the very poorest people. The very poorest people are the people that work for those small farmers as employees. And there it's very hard to get, because the employment is almost entirely informal. It's completely out of the reach of formal regulation, and very difficult to reach even by these social movements and consumer pressure, because these things tend to focus on the actual producer, the actual producer is called the farmer, rather than the very, very poor people who are dependent on them for work. Another policy question is, okay, when should you do this? Should you concentrate first on education and skills? Because the case study evidence and the econometric evidence agree that education and skills does attract in foreign direct investment, and educated and skilled women are what investors want. They're not after unskilled labour, particularly from women, because it's that the brains versus brawn thing. But is there some strategy into pushing these first and pushing these later? Because if you push these too soon, your investors will go elsewhere. And that's one of the difficulties that Vietnam is facing. They've got this really effective governments that can ramp these up. But if they ramp them up too fast, Cambodia is very close by, Thailand is very close by, Bangladesh is close by. There's other places that won't be ramping these up that can just attract their investment away. So that's the dilemma. Even if you know the right policy, if you apply that right policy, you might lose the investment. So please just take this lecture, as all lectures, but especially on the case studies, as an invitation to go and read some stuff. I also put in some evidence here on the sort of the reviews of literatures and more recent summaries, like the where did I put it? Yeah, the Charnas one, and the one I put further up with the reading on the games. So, and this is the one set in Nairobi, which is really simple and really picks out how the game is supposed to relate to the real economic behaviour they're trying to measure. So you can ask yourself about the ecological validity of that, and also the methodological questions come out very clearly in that. And this could be one. I recommend the Vietnam as well, really excellent. Okay, thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll get a chance to organise an online session where we can get some questions or comments. But for now, thanks for watching. Bye.